Hello and welcome back to our channel. Tonight, we delve into a story that is as chilling as it is heartbreaking. A story that reminds us that sometimes, the most monstrous acts are committed not by strangers in the dark, but by those we are supposed to trust the most, within the supposed sanctuary of our own homes. This is a story of manipulation, cruelty, and the ultimate betrayal. Before we begin, if you appreciate true crime stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important and often overlooked cases to light. Now, let's begin our story. The house stood on a quiet, tree-lined street in a respectable suburb, the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over manicured lawns, and the biggest scandal was usually a rogue garden gnome. To the outside world, the Park family was the epitome of success and traditional values. Mr. Park, the patriarch, was a retired businessman with a stern but respected reputation. His son, Ji-hoon, was a successful architect, and his wife, Min Seo, was a gentle and beautiful woman who seemed to have stepped out of a classic Korean drama. Min Seo had married into the Park family 5 years ago, full of hopes and dreams. She had fallen in love with Ji-hoon's quiet strength and his promises of a life filled with love and security. And for a while, it seemed she had found it. The first year of their marriage was a blissful blur of newlywed excitement. Ji-hoon was attentive, and even her father-in-law, a man of few words and even fewer smiles, seemed to tolerate her presence. Her mother-in-law had passed away years ago, leaving a void in the family that Min Seo naively hoped she could somehow help to fill. The house itself was a testament to the family's wealth. It was a spacious, 2-story dwelling with a meticulously cared-for garden in the back. Min Seo had her own small studio on the second floor where she would paint, a passion she had nurtured since childhood. It was her sanctuary, the one place in the house that felt truly hers. But as the years went on, the gilded cage began to reveal its bars. Ji-hoon, once so present, became increasingly consumed by his work. He would leave early in the morning and return late at night, often too exhausted for anything more than a perfunctory greeting. The loving husband who had once whisked her away for spontaneous weekend trips was replaced by a tired, distant man who seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Min Seo tried to be understanding. She knew his work was demanding, and she took pride in his success. She threw herself into being the perfect daughter-in-law, mastering traditional recipes, keeping the house immaculate, and catering to her father-in-law's every need. Mr. Park was a creature of habit. He would wake up at the crack of dawn, do his morning exercises in the garden, and then expect a perfectly prepared breakfast on the table by 7. He was a man who believed in order and discipline, and he ran his household with the same iron fist he had used to run his company. Min Seo quickly learned that any deviation from his rigid routine was met with a cold, disapproving stare or a cutting remark that would leave her feeling small and inadequate. The abuse began subtly, like a slow-acting poison. It started with comments about her cooking. "This soup is too salty," he would declare, pushing the bowl away. "My late wife had a much lighter touch. No matter how hard she tried, nothing she did was ever good enough. Her cleaning was always subpar. Her arrangements of flowers were always tasteless, and her voice, he once remarked, was as shrill as a cicada in summer." Min Seo tried to talk to Ji-hoon about it, but he would often dismiss her concerns. "That's just how he is, honey," he would say, his eyes glued to his phone. "He's from a different generation. Don't take it to heart." He seemed incapable of comprehending the corrosive effect his father's constant criticism was having on her. Or perhaps, she thought with a growing sense of dread, he simply didn't want to see it. Confronting his father would require a strength that Ji-hoon, for all his professional success, seemed to lack. As Min Seo's confidence withered under the relentless barrage of criticism, Mr. Park's control over her life tightened. He began to dictate what she wore, deeming her modern clothes too frivolous, and insisting she wear more traditional, somber attire. He would inspect her monthly allowance, questioning every purchase and making her account for every one. He even started to restrict her contact with her own family, claiming that her frequent visits to her parents were a distraction from her duties as a wife and daughter-in-law. One afternoon, Minasio's younger sister, Sujin, came to visit. The two sisters were very close, and Sujin's cheerful presence was a welcome respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the Park household. They were laughing in the living room, sharing stories and looking at old photos, when Mr. Park entered. A heavy silence immediately fell over the room. He gave Sujin a look of utter disdain before turning to Minacio. "Is this how you spend your days?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Giggling like a schoolgirl while this house falls into disarray?" Minacio's face burned with shame. "Father, Sujin just came to visit for a little while. Your sister should know that a married woman has responsibilities," he retorted, his cold eyes never leaving Minacio's face. "She is not a child anymore." Sujin, who was never one to back down from a fight, stood up. "With all due respect, sir, my sister is a grown woman and can decide for herself how to spend her time." Mr. Park's face contorted with rage. "You dare to speak to me in that tone in my own house?" he boomed. Before the situation could escalate further, Minacio quickly ushered her sister towards the door, whispering frantic apologies. As Sujin left, she gave Minacio a worried look. "Uni," she said, using the Korean term for older sister, "this isn't right. You need to talk to Jihoon Appa. You can't live like this." That night, Minacio did try to talk to Jihoon. She waited until his father had retired to his room, and then she approached her husband as he sat in his study, poring over blueprints. She recounted the incident with her sister, her voice trembling as she described the humiliation she had felt. Jihoon sighed, rubbing his temples. "Minacio, can we not do this tonight? I have a big presentation tomorrow." "But this is important, Jihoon," she pleaded. "He's trying to isolate me from my own family." "You're being overly dramatic," he said, his voice sharp with impatience. "Father is old-fashioned, that's all. He just wants what's best for us." "What's best for us?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "Or what's best for him? He controls every aspect of my life, Jihoon. I feel like I'm suffocating." Jihoon finally looked up from his blueprints, his eyes cold and distant. "This is my father's house, Minacio. We live here under his roof, and we will abide by his rules. I will not have you disrespecting him." The finality in his tone was like a slap in the face. In that moment, Minacio realized the devastating truth. She was utterly alone. Her husband, the man who had promised to love and protect her, had chosen his father over her. He had become a willing accomplice in her torment. The days that followed were a blur of quiet desperation. Minacio moved through the house like a ghost, her once vibrant spirit slowly being extinguished. She stopped painting, the colors on her canvases a stark reminder of the joy that had been drained from her life. She grew thinner, the dark circles under her eyes a testament to sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with a single, terrifying question. How had her life come to this? The physical abuse started a few months later. It was a scorching hot day in August, and Minacio had been working in the garden, trying to find some solace in the feel of the earth beneath her fingers. She had lost track of time and was a few minutes late in preparing her father-in-law's afternoon snack. When she brought the tray of chilled fruit and barley tea to his study, he was standing by the window, his back to her. "You are late," he said without turning around. "I'm sorry, father," she murmured, setting the tray down on his desk. "I was weeding the garden and didn't realize the time." He turned then, and the look on his face made her blood run cold. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fury. "You think you can do as you please in this house?" he hissed, advancing on her. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, father, of course not." He was in front of her now, his face just inches from hers. She could smell the faint, medicinal scent of the herbal tonics he drank every day. "You are a disgrace to this family," he spat, his voice low and menacing. "A lazy, disobedient wretch." And then he struck her. It was a swift, open-handed slap that sent her reeling. The force of the blow knocked her off balance, and she fell to the floor, her cheeks stinging. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and fear. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his face a mask of rage. He looked down at her with an expression of such profound contempt that it stole the air from her lungs. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his desk, picking up his newspaper as if nothing had happened. Minacio lay on the floor for a long time, the polished wood cool against her burning cheek. She was too stunned to cry, too frightened to move. The line had been crossed. The psychological torment had given way to physical violence, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. When Ji-hoon came home that night, she was waiting for him in their bedroom. She had put on makeup to hide the bruise, but the swelling was still noticeable. She didn't say anything, just looked at him, her eyes pleading with him to see, to understand. He glanced at her, a flicker of something concern, annoyance, crossing his face. "What happened to your cheek?" he asked, his voice flat. "Your father hit me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Minacio, I'm sure you're exaggerating. Father wouldn't do that." "I am not exaggerating," she cried, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally breaking. "Look at me, Ji-hoon. Look at my face." He took a step closer, his gaze falling on her swollen cheek. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she had married, a hint of concern in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by a familiar weariness. "What did you do to provoke him?" he asked. The question was like a physical blow, more painful than the slap itself. She stared at him, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The man she loved, the man who was supposed to be her protector, was now her accuser. From that day on, the abuse became a regular occurrence. It was never in front of Ji-hoon, of course. Mr. Park was too cunning for that. The violence would erupt over the slightest perceived transgression. A misplaced book, a lukewarm cup of tea, a moment of hesitation in obeying a command. He seemed to take a sadistic pleasure in her fear, his eyes lighting up as she cowered before him. Minacio began to document the abuse. She took pictures of her bruises with a small, disposable camera she had bought in secret. She wrote down the dates and times of the attacks in a diary she kept hidden in her art studio, tucked away behind a stack of old canvases. It was a desperate act of self-preservation, a silent scream for help that she was too afraid to utter out loud. She thought about leaving, of course. The thought consumed her waking moments and haunted her dreams. But where would she go? Her parents were getting older, and she couldn't bear the thought of burdening them with her problems. And she knew that Mr. Park would never let her go. He had made it clear that she was his property, a possession to be controlled and disciplined as he saw fit. One evening, as she was serving dinner, her hand trembled, and she spilled a few drops of soup on the pristine white tablecloth. Mr. Park's eyes narrowed, and she braced herself for the inevitable explosion. But instead of shouting, he simply smiled, a cold, cruel smile that did not reach his eyes. "Clumsy girl," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "You should be more careful." Later that night, as she was cleaning the kitchen, he came up behind her. She could feel his presence before she saw him, a cold dread washing over her. "I have something for you," he said. He was holding a small, ornate box. She took it from him, her hands shaking. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a beautiful, antique silver hairpin. "It belonged to my late wife," he said. "I want you to have it." She looked up at him, confused. This sudden act of kindness was more unnerving than his usual cruelty. "Wear it for me," he said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly, she put the hairpin in her hair. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Just like her." He reached out and stroked her cheek, the same cheek he had slapped just a few days before. She flinched at his touch, a wave of revulsion washing over her. He smiled again, that same cold smile, and then he left the room, leaving her alone in the silence, the silver hairpin feeling heavy and cold in her hair, a symbol of her gilded cage. She knew then that she was not just a prisoner, but a replacement, a stand-in for the dead wife he both mourned and despised. And in that moment, a new, more terrifying fear took root in her heart. She was not just being abused, she was being erased. The silver hairpin became a new instrument of torture. Mr. Park insisted that Minacio wear it every day. It was a constant, physical reminder of her subjugation, a cold weight in her hair that mirrored the cold weight in her soul. He would often comment on it, his words laced with a strange mixture of nostalgia and menace. "My wife had such beautiful hair," he would say, his eyes lingering on Minacio. "She knew how to please a husband." The psychological games intensified. He would pit her against the memory of his deceased wife, a woman Minacio had never met, but whose spectral presence now loomed over every aspect of her life. The house became a museum dedicated to a ghost, and Minacio was its unwilling curator. He would force her to cook his late wife's favorite dishes, wear her old clothes, and even practice her calligraphy. He was trying to mold her into a perfect replica, and with each passing day, Minacio felt her own identity slipping away, being replaced by a pale imitation of a dead woman. The physical violence also escalated, becoming more frequent and more severe. The slaps turned into punches, the shoves into violent shakings. He would corner her in the pantry, in the laundry room, in the darkened hallway upstairs, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, unpredictable rage. The attacks were always calculated, always in places where the bruises wouldn't be easily seen. He was a master of control, a puppeteer pulling her strings, and she was his helpless marionette. Ji-hoon, meanwhile, retreated further into his own world. He took on more projects at work, using his career as a convenient excuse to stay away from the toxic atmosphere of his home. On the rare occasions when he was there, he was either glued to his computer or asleep. He had become a stranger to Minacio, a ghost in his own marriage. She tried to show him her bruises once, pulling up her sleeve to reveal a series of ugly, purple marks on her arm. He had glanced at them, his face impassive, and then said, "You should be more careful. You're so clumsy." The denial was so absolute, so profound, that it drove Minacio to the brink of madness. Was she going crazy? Was she imagining all of this? She would look in the mirror at her bruised and battered body, at the fear in her own eyes, and know that it was real. But to the outside world, and even to her own husband, she was invisible, her suffering a figment of her overly dramatic imagination. Her only lifeline was her sister, Sujin. They would meet in secret in a small coffee shop on the other side of town. Sujin was horrified by what she saw. Her vibrant, talented sister had been reduced to a timid, frightened woman who jumped at every shadow. "You have to leave him, Yuni," Sujin would plead, her eyes filled with tears. "This will only get worse. He's going to kill you." "I can't," Minacio would whisper, her voice trembling. "I have nowhere to go, and he'll find me. You don't know what he's capable of." She showed Sujin the diary and the photos. Sujin was a practical, level-headed woman, a law student with a fierce sense of justice. She immediately began to research options, looking into shelters for battered women, contacting lawyers, and trying to formulate an escape plan. The plan was simple but dangerous. There was a small annual art fair in a nearby town. Minacio had submitted some of her paintings a few months earlier, before the abuse had reached its current fever pitch, and to her surprise, she had been accepted. It was the perfect cover. She would tell Mr. Park and Ji-hoon that she was going to the art fair for the day. Sujin would pick her up, and instead of going to the fair, they would drive to a shelter in a city several hours away. Sujin had already arranged everything. They had a place to stay, and a lawyer was ready to meet with them. The days leading up to the art fair were a nerve-wracking tightrope walk. Minacio had to pretend that everything was normal, that she was excited about the fair. She had to smile and nod and play the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law, all the while her stomach was in a knot of terror. Mr. Park seemed to be in a relatively good mood, which only made her more anxious. His periods of calm were often the prelude to the most violent storms. The night before she was due to leave, Ji-hoon came home early. It was a rare occurrence, and Min Seo's heart sank. She was in her studio, carefully wrapping her paintings, when he appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Just getting my paintings ready for the fair tomorrow," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He walked into the room, his eyes scanning the canvases. They were mostly landscapes, filled with the vibrant colors and light that had long since vanished from her life. "They're good," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'd forgotten how talented you are." He reached out and touched her arm, and she flinched, an involuntary reaction born of months of abuse. He frowned, a flicker of hurt in his eyes. "Min Seo," he said, his voice low, "I know things have been difficult lately." She looked at him, a tiny, foolish spark of hope igniting in her chest. Was he finally seeing her? Was he finally going to acknowledge her pain? "Father is under a lot of stress," he continued, and just like that, the spark died. "His health hasn't been good, and he's been on edge." "He's been on edge?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Ji-hoon, he's been beating me." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "He's an old man, Min Seo. He doesn't know his own strength." "That's not an excuse," she said, her voice rising. "He's cruel and he's violent, and you've done nothing to stop him. You've stood by and watched as he's destroyed me." "That's not true," he said, his voice defensive. "I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me?" She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "By telling me I'm clumsy? By telling me I'm exaggerating? You're not protecting me, Ji-hoon. You're enabling him." "What do you want me to do?" he shouted, his frustration finally boiling over. "He's my father. I can't just throw him out on the street." "So you'd rather let him kill me?" she screamed, the words tearing from her throat. A heavy silence fell between them, the truth of her words hanging in the air. Ji-hoon stared at her, his face a mixture of anger, guilt, and helplessness. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. Min Seo sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. She knew then, with a terrible certainty, that there was no hope for her marriage, no hope for Ji-hoon. He had made his choice and she was on her own. The escape plan was her only chance. The next morning, she got up early, her body moving on autopilot. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple, comfortable outfit for the long drive ahead. She went downstairs to make breakfast, her hands trembling so badly that she almost dropped the teapot. Mr. Park was already at the table, reading his newspaper. He looked up as she entered, his eyes cold and assessing. "You're going to that little art show today?" he asked. "Yes, father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't be late for dinner," he said, before disappearing behind his newspaper again. It was the most normal exchange they had had in months, and it terrified her. Ji-hoon was nowhere to be seen. He had left for work before she had even woken up. A part of her was relieved. She didn't think she could bear to look him in the face. She packed a small bag with her diary, the disposable camera, and a few essentials. She hid it in the garage near the side door. Soo-jin was going to pick her up in half an hour. Everything was set. She went back to her studio for one last look. She ran her hand over her easel, her fingers caressing the smooth, worn wood. This room had once been her sanctuary, her escape. Now it was a prison, a place filled with ghosts and broken dreams. She took one of her favorite paintings, a small watercolor of a field of wildflowers, and slipped it into her bag. It was a small, foolish gesture, but she needed to take something of her old self with her, a reminder of the woman she had been before she had become Mrs. Park. As she was about to leave the room, she noticed something on the floor, near the door. It was a small, silver object, glinting in the morning light. She bent down and picked it up. It was the hairpin. It must have fallen out of her hair during her argument with Ji-hoon the night before. A wave of nausea washed over her. She couldn't take it with she couldn't bear to have that piece of him, that symbol of her oppression, with her on her journey to freedom. She opened the window and, with a surge of adrenaline, she threw it as far as she could into the garden below. She watched it arc through the air, a silver speck against the green, before it disappeared into a bed of roses. A sense of lightness, of liberation, washed over her. It was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She went downstairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She was just about to open the front door when a voice behind her made her freeze. "And where do you think you're going?" She turned around slowly. Mr. Park was standing in the doorway of his study, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was calm, but his eyes were blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. I was just going to the art fair," she stammered. "Without this?" he asked, and he opened his hand. Lying in his palm was the silver hairpin. Minasio's blood ran cold. He must have seen her throw it from the window. He had been watching her. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're not leaving this house. Ever." He began to walk towards her, and she stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for the doorknob. But it was too late. He was on her in a flash, his fingers like iron talons digging into her arm. He dragged her, kicking and screaming, away from the door, away from the promise of freedom, and back into the suffocating darkness of the house. Her last thought before he knocked her unconscious was of her sister, waiting for her in her car just a few streets away, wondering why she was late. Sujin waited. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. 10 minutes, 20, half an hour. She called Minasio's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. This wasn't like her sister. Minacio was always punctual, almost to a fault. Sujin drove around the block, her eyes scanning the street. The Park house looked quiet, almost serene. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything was amiss. But Sujin knew better. She had a terrible feeling, a cold premonition that something had gone horribly wrong. She called again and again, her panic rising with each unanswered ring. She thought about going to the house, of banging on the door and demanding to see her sister. But she knew that would be a mistake. Mr. Park was a powerful man, with connections all over the city. If he had hurt Minacio, he would have a story ready, a plausible explanation for her absence. And Sujin, a young law student with no proof and no power, would be easily dismissed. She did the only thing she could think of. She went to the police. The officer on duty was a middle-aged man with a tired, world-weary face. He listened to her story with a patient, almost paternal air, but Sujin could see the skepticism in his eyes. "So, your sister was supposed to meet you this morning, and she didn't show up?" he said, summarizing her frantic, tear-filled account. "And you think her father-in-law has done something to her?" "I don't think it. I know it," Sujin insisted. "He's been abusing her for years. I have proof." She showed him the pictures on her phone, the pictures Minacio had sent her of her bruises. She told him about the diary. The officer sighed. "Miss, these are serious allegations. Domestic disputes are complicated. Are you sure your sister didn't just have a fight with her husband and decide to go somewhere to cool off?" "No," Sujin said, her voice firm. "She was leaving him. For good. She was scared for her life." The officer promised to send a car to the house to do a wellness check, but Sujin knew it was a token gesture. Without a body, without concrete evidence of a crime, her sister was just another missing person. Another woman who had run away from home. The police did go to the house. Mr. Park answered the door, the picture of a concerned father-in-law. He told them that Minacio had left for the art fair that morning, just as planned. He even showed them her empty studio, the wrapped paintings gone. He suggested that maybe she had decided to stay with a friend for a few days, that she had been under a lot of stress lately. Ji-hoon, when he was called, corroborated the story. He told the police that they had had an argument the night before, and that Minacio had been emotional. It was the perfect, plausible explanation. The police left. satisfied that there was no cause for alarm. Sujin was devastated, but she refused to give up. She launched her own investigation, plastering missing posters with Min Seo's picture all over the city. She hounded the police, calling them every day, demanding updates. She even hired a private investigator, a retired detective who was moved by her story and agreed to take the case pro bono. Meanwhile, back at the Park house, a gruesome secret was being kept. After Mr. Park had knocked Min Seo unconscious, he had dragged her down to the basement. It was a cold, damp space, filled with old furniture and forgotten relics of the past. In the corner, there was a large chest-style freezer, the kind used to store large quantities of meat. It hadn't been used in years. His mind was working with a cold, terrifying clarity. He knew that he couldn't let her leave. She knew too much. She would tell people about the abuse. She would show them her bruises. She would ruin him, destroy the carefully constructed facade of respectability he had spent his entire life building. There was only one solution. He opened the freezer. It was empty, save for a thin layer of frost. He looked down at Min Seo's unconscious form, a flicker of something regret, hesitation, crossing his face, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had brought this on herself. She had been disobedient, defiant. She had challenged his authority. She had to be punished. The details of what happened next are too horrific to contemplate. He was a methodical, efficient man, and he went about his gruesome task with the same precision he had used to run his business. He dismembered her body, his movements quick and practiced. He wrapped the remains in thick plastic bags, sealed them with duct tape, and placed them in the freezer. When he was finished, he cleaned the basement with bleach, scrubbing away every last trace of his crime. He took her packed bags, her paintings, and her car to a remote location and abandoned them. He was meticulous, leaving nothing to chance. The days that followed were a surreal performance. He played the part of the worried father-in-law, his face a mask of concern. He would call the police for updates, his voice filled with a convincing, sounding anxiety. He would comfort Ji-hoon, who seemed to be genuinely bewildered by his wife's disappearance. Whether Ji-hoon was a willing participant in the deception or a man in deep, profound denial, Sujin would never know. But Mr. Park had made one mistake. One small, seemingly insignificant error that would ultimately be his undoing. The silver hairpin. The private investigator Sujin had hired, a man named Mr. Choi, was a thorough, old-school detective. He didn't believe the story about Min Seo running away. He had seen too many cases like this, where a disappearance was a cover for something far more sinister. He started by re-interviewing all of Min Seo's friends and family. He learned about the abuse, about the escalating violence, about the oppressive control Mr. Park exerted over his daughter-in-law. He focused his investigation on the house. He knew that the answer, whatever it was there. He spent days watching the house, observing Mr. Park's comings and goings. He noticed that the old man was a creature of habit, except for one thing. Every morning, like clockwork, Mr. Park would go out into his garden and spend an inordinate amount of time tending to a particular bed of roses. It was a small thing, but it was enough to pique Mr. Choi's interest. One night, under the cover of darkness, he slipped into the garden. He had a small metal detector with him. He swept it over the rose bed, and it immediately began to beep. He dug into the soft earth with his hands, and his fingers closed around a small, cold, metal object. It was the silver hairpin. Mr. Choi knew he had found something important. He took the hairpin to Sujin, who identified it immediately. It was the one her sister had been forced to wear, the one she had hated with every fiber of her being. Sujin told him about how Min Seo had thrown it out the window on the morning of her disappearance. This was the piece of the puzzle that Mr. Choi had been missing. If Min Seo had thrown the hairpin into the garden before she left, why would Mr. Park have retrieved it and reburied it? Unless, of course, Min Seo had never left the house at all. Mr. Choi took his findings to the police. This time, they listened. The hairpin, combined with the testimony of Sujin and other friends, was enough to get them a search warrant. They arrived at the Park house early one morning, a team of 12 officers. Mr. Park was in the middle of his breakfast, his face a mask of indignation. Ji-hoon was there too, looking pale and confused. The search was thorough. They went through every room, every closet, every drawer. They found Min Seo's hidden diary and the disposable camera in her art studio. The diary was a chilling, detailed account of the years of abuse she had suffered. The photos were a heartbreaking gallery of her pain, a visual record of her husband's betrayal and her father-in-law's cruelty. But it was in the basement that they found the final, horrifying proof. One of the younger officers noticed the large chest freezer in the corner. It was plugged in, humming quietly. He asked Mr. Park what was inside. "Just some old meat," Mr. Park said, his voice dismissive. "We haven't used it in years." The officer was about to move on, but then he noticed something. The freezer was new, or at least it looked new. It was spotlessly clean, not a speck of dust on it. And the plug, he noticed, was also new. It didn't match the old, frayed wiring in the rest of the basement. He opened it. The stench that hit him was so overwhelming that he gagged, stumbling backward. The other officers rushed over, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Inside the freezer, packed tightly together, were the frozen, dismembered remains of a human body. A collective gasp went through the room. Ji-hoon's face went white, and he vomited on the floor. Mr. Park, however, remained strangely calm. He looked at the contents of the freezer, then at the horrified faces of the police officers. And then, he did something that would haunt them all for the rest of their lives. He smiled. The trial was a media sensation. The gruesome details of the case shocked and horrified the nation. Mr. Park, the respectable businessman, the stern but loving patriarch, was revealed to be a monster. He never showed any remorse, never offered any explanation for his actions. He sat in the courtroom, day after day, with the same cold, arrogant expression on his face. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Ji-hoon was also investigated, but there was no evidence to suggest that he had been involved in the murder itself. He was charged with negligence and failing to report the abuse, and he received a suspended sentence. He lost his job, his reputation, and the respect of everyone who had ever known him. He became a pariah, a man haunted by the ghost of the wife he had failed to protect. Soo-jin was in the courtroom every day. She sat in the front row, her face a stoic mask, forcing herself to listen to the horrific details of her sister's final moments. She was there for Min Seo, to be her voice, to make sure that the world knew what had been done to her. After the trial, Soo-jin dedicated her life to helping other victims of domestic violence. She finished law school and became a prosecutor, specializing in cases of abuse. She fought for tougher laws, for better support systems, for a world where no woman would have to suffer in silence as her sister had. The Park house was sold. The new owners, unaware of its gruesome history, renovated it, painting over the walls that had witnessed so much pain, planting a new garden over the soil that had once held a terrible secret. But for those who knew the story, the house would forever be a place of darkness, a monument to a life cut tragically short. Min Seo was finally laid to rest in a peaceful cemetery overlooking the sea. Her gravestone was simple, with just her name and the dates of her birth and death. But underneath, Soo-jin had a small inscription carved, a line from one of Min Seo's favorite poems. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. It was a small, defiant act of remembrance, a final tribute to a woman who had been filled with so much love, so much light, so much color. A woman who had been a daughter, a sister, an artist, a dreamer. A woman whose life had been brutally and senselessly extinguished, but whose story would live on, a cautionary tale whispered on the wind, a tragic reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we call family.